Hello, dear friends, brothers, sisters, and fellow spiritual aspirants. Welcome to this ninth episode in our special series of attaining and living in the state of what we call as the reality, being the self, or living in a state of unconditional love and living in a state of absolute happiness. So this particular episode is called All is Self. You see, all is absolute happiness. So look at it. If you were to deal with anything in your life, whether it is good or it is bad, if it is the same reality, if it is the same absolute happiness, if it is the same self or God that is appearing, you see, either that happiness or that misery or whatever form or function it may be that you're actually dealing with, if it is the same thing that you deal with, then it's quite natural that you can live in this state of absolute happiness. And then we are saying that the title is All is Self or All is Absolute Happiness. So the question which arises here, you see, is that how is this possible? So just summarizing in this particular episode, how do we realize that all is actually absolute happiness or all is self? There are four questions. You see, there are four queries which arise in the mind of a spiritual aspirant, or in your mind, or in my mind, who is pursuing the path of spiritual happiness. So what are these four questions? Number one, that all is self, right? So if all is self, then the second question which arises is that what is the nature of this self or absolute happiness, right? What is its nature? And then the third question which arises is that how do you, the spiritual aspirant, interpret? How do you interpret that everything that you deal with is absolute happiness? So the third question is more important. You see, how do you interpret that whatever you see is absolute happiness? And then last of all, you see, how do you live? How will you live in this state of unconditional love or absolute happiness, or knowing consciously that all is self or everything is God only? So these are the four questions which we will try and answer. So let us look at the first one. The first query or the question which has arisen is that all is self. You see, how all is self? Look at this figure 1, right? This figure 1 shows that the self has a twofold nature, or this absolute happiness has a twofold nature. You see how the arrows are curving down in figure 1? On one side, the nature of this self is, you see, changeless. Or how all is self? Because one, it is changeless. Changeless means, you see, whatever you do, look at it, whatever you do, you can't take away one fact that you have to be conscious of whatever you do. And just being conscious of whatever you do, you can practically look at it and try it out. You see, being conscious of anything is a changeless function. And that's exactly what is shown in figure 1. That is one nature of this absolute happiness. But then, you see, whatever you deal with, look at it, whether you are eating food, taking a bath, thoughts, breath, walking, going to work, doing some exercise, listening to this video. You see, these are all images, these are all appearances, these are all events, these are all forms and functions, and they are constantly changing. Now, this is what you've got to really understand here, is that the other nature of self or absolute happiness is changing. So this change and changing, you see, this is basically what you've got to understand. How all is self is that whatever is, right, whatever is, wherever, however, right, whatever is, wherever, however, you see, all is only absolute happiness or only self, you see. And all these appearances, these images that you see that appear to be different is only self, right? So we finish here with figure 1, and now we come to the second question, right? The second question is that if all this is a self, if we are saying that whatever is, however is, wherever is, if all that is self, then you see, the $1 million question which arises here is, and which is actually correct, the second question is, then what is the nature of this self? See, if you look at yourself, you know what your nature is, the way you think, the way you feel, the way you do things, the way you function, right? So every human being on earth is unique and has their own particular nature. So similarly, you see, if everything is self, then what is the nature of this self? You see, so let us look at this figure 2. So what is this figure 2 showing? That you see, one, self is this illuminating consciousness, right? So how is self this illuminating consciousness? Look at it. As you are sitting, right, the view of this video and whatever is around you is right in front of you, isn't it? Now, as I had said, that you have to be conscious of whatever you see. You see, just like when you sit in a room, in a dark room, and you put on the light, it illuminates the light, the area, right? The light illuminates that room. Similarly, when it is very early morning, just say before sunrise, everything is dark. But when the sun rises, there is illumination of light everywhere. Similarly, you see, this light of consciousness is flowing from you. Look at it. As you sit, this light of consciousness flows everywhere. It's just like the light of the sun illuminating that part of earth, right? So the nature of this self or absolute happiness is this illuminating consciousness, which we only interpret. Because this illuminating consciousness, this is absolute happiness, this is the reality. And in this illuminating consciousness only, you are even actually able to listen and watch this particular video or episode 9 called All is Self, right? And then as we look at this figure 2, look, you see there's an arrow coming down and there's an arrow going up. Now this arrow which is coming down, it says that self is wondrous. You see, and this is quite interesting. The other nature of self is wondrous means that you see this huge space-time manifestation, you see, which is appearing on this screen of illuminating consciousness. You see, in this space-time manifestation, it is just mind-boggling. You see, in this there are so many gods, angels, archangels, the Hindu gods, the Greek god and goddesses. They say there are about 65 billion total human spirits. Right? There are so many planes. You look at the sky, you look at the planets, You look at our own galaxy, the Milky Way, there are millions and millions of solar systems in it. So you see, this ever-changing nature of self is what we term as the wondrous nature of self. So the nature of self is twofold. The nature of self is untainted consciousness. The right word would be, you see, the nature of self is illuminating consciousness. The nature of self is this untainted silence, you see, because look at it, this illuminating consciousness, nothing can actually make any difference, you see, untainted, unblemished. You see, it just silently continues with its function of illuminating everything and you becoming conscious of whatever you want to be conscious of, right? So, and the other is that the nature of self is wondrous. You know, what we call as this manifestation of space and time, what we call as creation, preservation, and dissolution, right? That is the wondrous nature of self. So the nature of self is the state of silence. And the nature of self or absolute happiness is that nature that what we call as the liberated they attain. You see, what do we mean by that the liberated attain? Means that if you are really able to understand the nature of self, and if you're able to understand the next two queries that we will answer, then you will also enter into that same lineage as the great sages, like, look at Jesus Christ, look at Gautam Buddha, look at Sage Ramana, look at Rishi Master Byensa Duno. You see, they are called the illuminated entities or beings because they live in this state of absolute happiness, you see, or in that state of that full realization that whatever they deal with, they are only dealing with absolute happiness, or they are only dealing with consciousness, they are only dealing with the self, whether it is in its changeless nature, the illuminating consciousness nature, or it is in this wondrous nature of creation, preservation, and dissolution. So now we'll take away this figure 2, and we have actually answered the second question, that what is the nature of self. Now we come to the third most important question or query. You see, the third and the fourth queries which we are actually going to answer are actually the most important, because the question which arises here is that how do you as an individual or as a spiritual aspirant, or as an individualized, unique personality, how do you actually interpret that all is actually self? Now, you see, there are two means by which we will tackle and answer this question. So I'll just put up this figure 3. Right? Now look at this figure 3. It says consciousness, then there is an arrow, and then it says objects. Right? And then it says, you see in bracket, note that very carefully, it says no gap. Now this is very interesting, you see, and also very rarely, you see, mark my words, very rarely are you going to come across, you see, what is going to be explained now. And it is hardly taken into consideration in one's journey to absolute happiness. You see this word, no gap. Now look at it. You know, everybody would have gone to the sea one time or the other, or if you haven't, you would have seen a picture of the sea or the ocean. Now, look at this very carefully. You see that when you look at the ocean, there are the waves which are appearing on the ocean or the sea, but they are sticking to the sea. Isn't it? We never think about that. I mean, have you actually ever been to riverside, or have you ever been to the seaside or to an ocean, right? Or even when you are watching, say, a video, you can just go and watch a video of the sea, after this. Have you actually ever seen that the waves, they suddenly rise up? Say the waves are 7 meters apart above the sea level, or the waves are, say, 7 meters separated, from that river where you are. And there is a gap, and there is vacuum, there is space between the waves appearing there and the sea beneath. That never happens, isn't it? It cannot be. There can be no gap between the sea surface or the river surface and those waves. I really want you to understand this, you see. This is very, very important. Look, there is no gap between the waves and the substratum, which is the sea. Right? No gap. So similarly, look at this. There is no gap between the light of consciousness and all these images that are actually appearing, right? There is no gap. There is absolutely no gap between the images and the consciousness. You see, so what we are saying is that the waves of the phenomenal world. You see, what do we mean by waves of the phenomenal world? Means the sun, the moon, the stars, the physical bodies, the plants, the animals, the stones, Mother Earth. You see, these are all waves, you see, of this phenomenal world. They are rising and subsiding in the ocean of absolute happiness, or in the ocean of self-consciousness. Look at this. A thought comes from you. It comes from somewhere. It comes from the light of consciousness. It stays in the light of consciousness and dissolves in that. You are born in this consciousness. You live in this consciousness, and you die in this consciousness. Mark this very carefully. Before you start anything, this ocean in the form of illuminating consciousness is present. When you are doing something, whatever you may be doing, you see, whatever it may be, meditation, listening to this video, eating, playing, going to work, traveling in a train, consciousness is present. The wave of consciousness, the ocean of consciousness, is present. What is being done are only just waves, right? And then after you have done whatever you wanted to do, the light of consciousness is still present before, during, and after. You see, awareness or self or absolute happiness is everywhere. It is at all times. It is here and it is now, and there is no gap, right? So, you see, what we are calling as this changing nature of self or absolute happiness, or what we are calling as these waves, make no mistake. You see, they are nothing more than this light of consciousness only appearing as those, waves, or you see, what we call as the forms and functions of this space-time manifestation. And look at it. There is no gap. Truly, there cannot be anything in between. There cannot be anything in between, right? Okay. So from this, we are still going to continue with this analysis. We will move on to figure 4. You see, now look at this figure 4. This is absolutely beautiful, and it completely proves, it will completely prove to you that actually, you see, all is self. How you will interpret that all is self? Look at this. It says there that the modifications of water, it says in figure 4 that the modifications of water are only water. Right? It is actually true. You see, when you go to the ocean, when the waves they appear, the ocean is also water. Its modification, the waves, is also water. Right? I'll further give examples of this. So similarly, you see this world and individuals, this world and all these individuals, all these appearances being in self, right? Being in self are only the self. So just reading a verse here, the world and beings, the superimposition seen as adhering on the substratum of self, you see, are only the supreme self, the enduring substratum, right? This is the ultimate conclusion of the scriptures, right? And this is the experience of those who are enlightened. Now let's just, take a further interpretation of this. You see, when you look at a tree, what is the tree made of? The tree is made of wood, isn't it? When you look at a wooden bed, what is the wooden bed made of? It's still made of wood, right? When you look at a wooden chair, what is the chair made of? It is still made of wood. You see, but we are actually busy looking at the tree, looking at the wooden bed, looking at a wooden table. We are only busy with the forms. We do not see the underlying reality, the underlying absolute happiness, or we actually don't see wood, right? Let me give you another example. You know, when you see everyone lives in a house, right? Now, when you enter into a house, basically we are lost in the shape of the house. You know, how are the windows? How high are the windows? How high is the ceiling? How big is the room? How big is the living room? How good is the toilet? And so on, But have you actually ever thought that when you look at a house, it is made up of bricks, mortar, roof tiles, whatever you may call it, but all the walls, all the windows, whatever this house is made up of, all the material has come from the same Mother Earth. Whether you talk of trees, wood, or you talk of tiles, terracotta tiles, or you talk of cement, everything has come from Mother Earth. But who looks at Mother Earth? Everyone is busy in looking at how good the house is looking. And this is exactly where our fault lies. You see, you don't look at the substratum. You don't look at that which is changeless and which is actually underlying. You don't look at the changeless light of consciousness on the screen of which everything appears. When you go to see a picture, have you seen that on the cinema hall, on that screen, is there any gap at all between the actors, and the actresses, and whatever you see? Is there any gap between those and the screen? Maybe if it's a 3D picture, you wear some glasses, but there also you're fooling yourself. It's still, everything is actually appearing on that screen. Look at it very carefully. There is no gap, and whatever appears on the screen, that screen may be cut up in the form of that shape, but actually it is the screen, right? Similarly, everything, and experiment with it. I'm not just saying that you take these words for granted. You experiment with it. You see, everything that is appearing on this screen of illuminated consciousness is illuminated consciousness. Doesn't matter how different it may look. You see, it does not matter, how different actually it may look. It is the light of consciousness. This is how you interpret it. These are some of the examples that we have actually given. Okay, so now we have actually answered the third question as well, that how do you as a spiritual aspirant interpret that actually all is illuminating consciousness, right? Now we move on, you see, to the last and the most important question of our discussion, and this is that how do you now live? How do you then consciously live without forgetting, right? Even though whatever you may be doing, that is fine, without forgetting that whatever you deal with, however you deal with it, it is nothing but the self, or it is absolute happiness, or you see, the reality or pure consciousness, right? So this is actually quite interesting. And when actually you study the scriptures quite deeply, you see, there are very beautiful interpretations as well actually given of this. You see, now let us look at this figure 5, right? Now, look at this figure 5. What it is saying is that all is self, right? Of course, that is the topic of our discussion. But then below that it says contemplate, right? So, just a little reading here, that there are various means, you see, prescribed by the scriptures, such as activities suitable for aspirants of different levels. You see, so that freedom from this cycle of birth and death may be actually attained. So among these, listening is good, right? But and others also, meditation and others may be useful, but contemplation of the self is the best. Mark the word contemplation. It is not reflection. The word here being used is contemplate, right? And it says that then grace means that living in this state of unconditional happiness will be realized very soon. So the question which now arises is, what are you actually going to contemplate? You see, go back, just go a little bit back on question number 3, where we had discussed that there is no gap. You see, whatever appears on this ocean of consciousness, the screen of consciousness, is actually consciousness. Whatever appears on this screen of absolute happiness or self, there is no gap, and that is the self. Now, you see, this is basically what you need to contemplate on, right? By this contemplation means looking directly at it, experiencing it as this being the reality. You see, there is no reflection here. You're looking directly at this. You see, just like, say when you're driving a car, you're not thinking too much. You just drive, isn't it? You just naturally know, that there's a car in front of you, you need to slow down, or there is no car, you need to speed up. Whenever you are driving a bike, you don't think too much, you just drive. So that is actually a good example which just came to my mind about contemplation. I may use a term, may not exactly fit, but intuitively knowing. You see, contemplating, intuitively knowing, this is beautiful actually, intuitively knowing, contemplating, right? Without thought, without feeling, direct experience. That's really what it is. It is direct experience. Okay, we will just go on this same analysis to figure 6. You see, look at this figure 6. What is the figure 6 saying? The figure 6 says that 1, you are the self. Okay, you are the self, and then you are also the individual, right? Means you are the screen, you are the light of consciousness, and you are also that form as well. Realize this, contemplate on this. You see, what is said here is that in order to efface the misery of this recurring birth and deaths, the misery of this world that you face every time that you come here, in order to get rid of it, to finish it, right? This misery should be removed by means of the constant contemplation of self. And remember, I said constant contemplation means knowing intuitively, you see, that all that is sentient is the undivided supreme self. That you see, everything actually, every form, every appearance that you see actually is the self, is absolute happiness. It is that reality. Whatever appears in consciousness, whatever appears on the screen of consciousness is consciousness itself, right? And who is actually saying this? You are actually saying this. Who is saying that, who is saying I am Anil? I am saying that I am Anil. You use your name and you say I am Jack, or I am Henry, or I am Diana, right? Or I am Vibha. You see, whatever the name may be, right? Who is actually saying? Look at it very carefully. You are the one who is saying this. The one who is saying that you are actually saying is actually none other than the self, the light of consciousness, the substratum, the reality. Look at it very carefully. You see, realize that all that is sentient is the undivided supreme self, and that supreme self, you, that is actually you. This is the correct contemplation, and this is basically how you will be actually able to live in what we call as this state of absolute happiness. Okay, so we have actually answered all the 4 questions. That all is self. What is the nature of this self? How do you interpret that all is self? And then how do you live in this state of absolute happiness? By constant, changeless contemplation. Right? So now let us come to the conclusion of this particular episode 9, that all is self. What is the conclusion? You see, let us look at this figure 7. You see, what is this figure 7 saying? It says creator, that which has created, that supreme being, preserver, that which preserves everything, and the destroyer, the one that is actually destroying everything, that great God, right? It is all, they are all nothing but the self. They are all actually that absolute happiness. They are all actually nothing but the consciousness. And then you see there is an arrow. And this arrow actually says that everything that is created, creation, everything that is preserved, preservation, and everything that is destroyed, that is destruction, that also is none other than the self, right? All is self. So you see, self itself appears as the creator, self itself appears as the sustainer, self itself appears as the destroyer, self itself appears as the gods, self itself appears as this creation, self itself appears as this existence, self itself appears as this dissolution, self itself appears as all, self itself is all, right? So creator, preserver, destroyer. And that which is created, that is which is preserved, which is destroyed, right? Everything, the changeless, that is the light of consciousness, and all this what is changing is none other than the self. Look, when you are in space and time, you cannot take away the fact that everything is created, everything is preserved, and it is actually destroyed. This is the universal law running through space and time. Whether it's your breath, whether it's your thought, whether you are listening to this video, there's a point of creation, then preservation, and then dissolution, right? So this is the conclusion of this particular episode. And if you're able to contemplate, intuitively experience, what we have discussed, that all is self, all is absolute happiness, then rest assured grace will be on you, and you will actually be living in this beautiful state of absolute happiness. So with that, I will bring this video to a close. I am extremely thankful, namaskar, as we say, the Hindus say, thank you, as we say in the Western world, in Christianity. You see, I thank all of you from the core of my heart. And I also put forward my namaskar to all of you for having so patiently given your most valuable, the most precious time of yours to have listened to this video. And I hope that this will assist you in your spiritual journey to live in that state of absolute unconditional happiness. Thank you.